Once upon a time, in the heart of a vibrant coastal town, where the ocean waves crashed against the shore like relentless reminders of persistence, there lived a young man named Marcus. He was in his early 30s, with a spark of ambition in his eyes that had dimmed over the years. Marcus ran a small startup selling eco-friendly outdoor gear, backpacks, tents, and water bottles made from recycled materials. He dreamed of turning it into a thriving business that not only made him financially free, but also helped protect the environment he loved. But for the past few years, his days blurred into a cycle of disappointment. Cold calls that went nowhere, pitches that fell flat, and orders that trickled in like rare rain in a drought. He often wondered if success was just a myth for people like him. One foggy morning, as Marcus sat at his cluttered desk overlooking the harbor, sipping black coffee that had gone cold, he stared at his sales log. Another rejection email had just pinged in his inbox from a big retailer who'd said no to stocking his products. "Why bother?" he muttered, feeling the weight of defeat. But then, a memory surfaced from his grandfather, an old fisherman who'd spent decades on those same waters. His grandfather had always talked about something called the law of averages. "Boy," he'd say with a weathered grin, "do enough of anything and a pattern will appear. Wins and losses aren't random forever. Over time, the numbers even out." Marcus leaned back in his chair, letting the words sink in. Most people like him wanted success to come quick. They wanted every effort to pay off, every attempt to work, every seed to grow. But life didn't work that way. Sometimes the answer was yes, sometimes it was no. Sometimes the door opened, sometimes it closed. If you judged your future by one or two attempts, like that single rejection email, you'd miss the bigger truth. The truth was in the averages. He thought back to his early days in business. When he talked to one potential client and they said no, it felt like failure. When he pitched to 10 and 8 turned him down, discouragement set in like the evening tide. But if 2 said yes and he kept repeating the process, he'd discover the ratio. Maybe it was 1 out of 5, maybe 3 out of 10. But once the pattern appeared, he had something priceless: predictability. The law of averages leveled the field. It meant Marcus didn't have to count on luck or wait for the stars to align. He just had to keep adding to the numbers. Because the law was always working, over time the results would reflect the ratio. That was the principle that could change everything. Once he understood it, he'd stop getting discouraged by rejection. He'd stop taking no as final. He'd stop quitting too soon. Instead, he'd start looking at each attempt as one more step toward the inevitable yes. This principle didn't just apply to business, Marcus realized as he paced his small office. It applied to every part of life: relationships, learning, personal growth. It was all governed by the same law. Read enough books and you'd find the insights that changed your thinking. Meet enough people and you'd find the friendships that lasted a lifetime. Practice enough times and you'd develop the skill. The averages always showed up if you gave them enough chances. So the law of averages told him, your job isn't to control outcomes. Your job is to increase activity. Keep planting, keep trying, keep reaching. Don't measure success by the single attempt. Measure it by the pattern that emerges when you've done it often enough. That's how it would change how he approached his work, his goals, his entire philosophy of success. If the law of averages was true, and Marcus was starting to believe it was, then the key to making it work was simple: activity. No activity, no averages. He couldn't expect the numbers to balance out if he never got into the game. Every call he made, every conversation he started, every door he knocked on, every seed he planted, it all added to the total. And that meant the more he tried, the more chances he created. The law of averages rewarded activity, not waiting. Marcus remembered a conversation with a fellow entrepreneur at a local networking event. The man was discouraged because nobody was saying yes to his ideas. Marcus asked how many people he'd spoken to. 3, the man replied, just 3. Now think about it, 3 wasn't a test of the law of averages. 3 wasn't a pattern, that was just dabbling. The law didn't work with dabbling, it worked with volume, with persistence, with repetition. If you played the game enough times, the ratios would show up. 1 in 5, 2 in 10, whatever the number was. It wouldn't reveal itself until you'd put in enough attempts. And once you saw the number, you could start planning your success around it. But the door to that discovery was activity. Like the farmer who plants one seed and it doesn't grow, he doesn't give up on farming. He plants fields full of seeds. Some sprout, some don't. That's the law of averages at work. But only the farmer who plants enough gets to see the harvest. The man who plants one seed and waits has no harvest at all. The same was true in business, in sales, in relationships. The person who makes one call and stops will always be disappointed. The person who keeps dialing, keeps showing up, keeps starting conversations, sooner or later, the law of averages begins to reward him. And here's the beauty of it. The activity itself is what sets the law in motion. Every attempt is a vote for the future. Every effort is a step toward the inevitable yes. Marcus didn't know which attempt would produce it, but he knew that enough attempts would. So if he wanted the averages on his side, he had to earn it with action. He had to stay in motion. Don't wait for perfect timing. Don't wait for guaranteed success. Just start. The law wouldn't reveal itself until he gave it numbers to work with. Activity was the trigger. The more he tried, the more the law of averages started working in his favor. Energized by this realization, Marcus decided to put it to the test. He grabbed his phone and started making calls, not just a few, but dozens. He emailed suppliers, pitched to local stores, and even set up a booth at the weekend farmers market. At first, the no's piled up like driftwood on the beach, but he kept going. Once he'd put in enough activity, the law of averages began to reveal its pattern. Maybe it was 1 in 5 who said yes. Maybe 3 in 10 who responded. Whatever the ratio, once it showed itself, he just gained an incredible advantage: predictability. See, most people thought success was guesswork. They thought it was all about chance or luck. But the law of averages removed the mystery. Once Marcus knew the pattern, he could start to plan with confidence. If he knew that 1 out of 5 would say yes, all he had to do was talk to 20 people. And he could expect 4 agreements. That wasn't luck, that was math. This turned effort into a science. It meant he no longer rode the emotional roller coaster of one person's response. A no wasn't the end of the story, it was simply part of the ratio. He didn't stop, he just kept going until the numbers worked themselves out. He thought of his own past frustrations. Like that time he pitched to a chain of outdoor stores and took the rejection personally. Every no felt like a blow to his confidence. But now, viewing it differently, if his ratio was 1 in 10, then every no he heard wasn't rejection, it was progress. Each no was just moving him closer to the next yes. Once he understood that, rejection lost its sting. Instead of dreading it, he started counting it. 10 conversations meant 1 result, and he could predict it with certainty. That's the power of patterns. They let you stop guessing and start working the numbers. When you know the averages, you know the outcome is inevitable. Effort plus time produces results, not just sometimes, but every time you stay consistent. It's like a casino. The house doesn't win every hand. Sometimes players take the pot, but the casino understands the averages, and over time, those averages guarantee their success. They don't have to win every spin or every roll. They just have to let the math play out. That's why the house always wins in the long run. The same principle applied to Marcus's life and business. He didn't have to win every day. He didn't have to succeed in every conversation. He just had to stay active long enough for the law of averages to deliver its promise. Once he saw the pattern, he gained a new kind of confidence. He didn't need to hope anymore, he knew. He didn't need to wonder anymore, he could measure. And that certainty allowed him to keep going without fear. That's how the law of averages made success predictable. But the law of averages was powerful only if he stayed with it long enough. Persistence was what unlocked the payoff. Most people never saw the law reward them, not because the law failed, but because they quit too soon. Here's the truth. Averages only showed up over time. He couldn't test them in a single day or with a handful of attempts. The ratio needed room to breathe. He had to give the numbers enough space to balance out. Think about baseball, Marcus mused as he watched a local game one evening. Even the best hitters in the world struck out, popped up, or got thrown out more times than they got on base. But over a season, their batting average told the real story. 3 hits out of 10 at-bats made you one of the greats. But if that player judged himself by one game, he'd quit. If he judged himself by one strikeout, he'd never step back up to the plate. Success belonged to the player who stuck around long enough for the average to work in his favor. It was the same everywhere. The first week might feel discouraging. The second month might feel slow. But the law was still at work, quietly balancing, quietly revealing the ratio. And if Marcus persisted, he'd see it unfold. He'd watched so many friends quit just before the numbers swung back their way. They heard too many no's, faced too many setbacks, and walked away, without realizing the yes was just around the corner. That was the tragedy of impatience. The law was ready to reward them, but they gave up too early. Persistence turned rejection into inevitability. Instead of hearing no and thinking failure, persistence let him hear no and think, I'm one step closer. Instead of quitting after 10 tries, persistence said, I'll try 100 if that's what it takes. Because the averages guaranteed the result. And here's something important. Persistence wasn't just about endurance, it was about belief. Belief that the law was real. Belief that effort multiplied by time always produced results. That belief kept him moving when emotions tempted him to stop. The law of averages was like gravity. It didn't stop working just because he was tired. It didn't disappear because he had a rough week. It kept operating. The only question was whether he'd stay in the game long enough to let it pay off. That's the role of persistence. It's the bridge between effort and reward. Now let's talk about how Marcus applied the law of averages in his own life. Knowing the principle was one thing, using it was another. The first step was to track his activity. He didn't just guess, he wrote it down. How many calls did he make? How many conversations did he start? How many times did he attempt? Numbers didn't lie. Once he tracked, he began to see the patterns emerge. Maybe 1 in 5 turned into a yes. Maybe 1 in 7. Whatever the ratio, it was his personal average. And once he knew it, he could plan his success around it. The second step was to stay consistent. The law didn't work for the person who tried hard once in a while. It worked for the person who put in steady effort over time. 10 calls every day beat 50 calls once a month. Small, repeated actions activated the averages. Third, he had to accept rejection as part of the math. This is where so many people got it wrong. They heard no and took it personally. They thought it meant they weren't good enough or not cut out for it. But no wasn't a verdict. It was just part of the ratio. If his average was 1 in 10, then 9 no's weren't failures. They were necessary steps to get to the one yes. That perspective changed everything. And finally, stay in motion. The law of averages wasn't for the idle. It didn't reward the thinker, it rewarded the doer. It didn't respond to intentions, it responded to attempts. He couldn't sit at home waiting for the numbers to balance. He had to give the law something to work with. So here's how it played out for Marcus. He tracked his numbers, watched the pattern, accepted the no's, and kept going. If he did, the law of averages guaranteed that success became only a matter of time. That was the beauty of it. He didn't need to be the smartest. He didn't need to be the most talented. He just needed to play long enough with enough activity for the averages to do their job. And if he committed to that, the results would come, inevitably. Months later, as his business began to flourish with steady orders and partnerships, Marcus stood on the beach at sunset, watching the waves. The law of averages had turned his struggles into a story of triumph. It wasn't magic. It was math, motion, and persistence. And now he shared it with others, knowing that anyone could harness it if they just kept going.